We'll restart the Stream 6 hearing. We have representatives, some of the representatives of Wellington International Airport present in person. Since set this week, we've received a joint witness statement from Mr. Jeffries and Ms. O'Sullivan, which we read yesterday. I've read your memorandum that you tabled this morning, viewer. Picked up on it. I was going to ask Ms. O'Sullivan about herself, namely the issues that weren't discussed at the conference, but that's okay. Deal with that. And you've tabled a brief from Ms. Lester. And I have to admit, I'm more than mildly perturbed about the latter, because it's effectively a reply to matters that have already been heard, which is prejudicial to other submitters, namely Ms. Weber. So it's also contrary to the rules of hearing that we tabled, that while witnesses could provide a summary no more than 3 pages of their evidence, which we envisaged would pick up any changes in the interim. So I'd invite you to tell me why we should accept it.
Well, my apologies. That's my fault and not Miss Lester's. I suppose I take the view that rather than having you madly write down what someone might say orally, it's better to actually provide you with it in writing to save your hands. And so that is the only reason that it was filed, was for your assistance. I'm happy for you to not accept it, and for Miss Lester to just summarise her evidence that was filed.
As I say, my concern is about the prejudice to Ms. Weber and Guardians of the Bays in particular, who have given their evidence, and you're effectively replying to it, which you wouldn't normally have the ability to do so other than verbally and briefly. So having raised that that issue, that I think that I do need to confer with my colleagues about whether we should accept it, but I didn't want to do that before hearing what you had to say about it. So we'll take a brief adjournment.
Do you want us to leave the room when you do?
No, we'll go next door.
Sure.
It'll only be a few minutes. Thank you. we'll resume the hearing. We've decided that we won't accept Ms. Lester's evidence on the basis that it's prejudicial to other submitters. And in breach of our hearing directions. Ms. Sullivan, yes, is online and hopefully able to hear us. So thank you for between the three of you for the track changes. We will ask Ms. O'Sullivan to take us through, in particular, the blue underlining, but anything else that she may wish to talk to us about as part of the introduction to her evidence. Like I had a number of questions arising out of the joint witness statement for her, but it may be that she'll pick them up on the way by as well.
I'm hopeful that's what will happen.
And but we have some legal submissions from you, which may or may not have been overtaken by events. So how would you like to proceed?
Well, I've just got a few notes that I do want to raise with you arising from the day one of the hearing that are more of a legal matter rather than a planning matter. Yep. So the first is there was a question raised about the scope of the airport's submission, and in particular the tracked document that was circulated, ostensibly showing the tracked changes to the airport zone. Now, obviously, the airport provided a new zone, a replacement zone, and that's been criticised by a submitter and Mr. Jeffries. It's a bit like asking the council itself to provide a track change version of the operative plan to the proposed plan. Of course, you don't do that if you're rewriting it. Wellington Airport was faced with unravelling, I think that was a term the chairman used, of unravelling the zone rules, which were overcomplicated and mixed up the designation and the plan provisions. And the airport and its advisors had tried very hard to consult with the council before those notified provisions came out, without much success. So when the plan was finally notified, and I acknowledge it was a bit of a rush around that time, so the best thing that the airport thought it could do was to redraft it. This document that was provided, the tracked changes document, was provided at the request of Mr. Jeffries for the purpose of some informal discussions that were happening as he was drafting his Section 42A report. It was never intended to be circulated. So in my submission, there's simply no issue as to scope. The scope of the airport's submission is as it was summarised, as it was made in its original submission, which is to replace it, and with that appendix which sets out the replacement zone.
I think that you will have heard that my read was that in trying to prepare as you say, a complex track document, the inclusion of, is it 3.3?
Yes.
Was 3.3. Now the number has changed. Was just an error in the tracking.
It was, yeah, it was just an error.
And I think that was the message Mr. Jeffries gave us. So if you're confirming that it was an error, I'm sure that we're happy to accept that it was an error. And as you say, we revert to the airport's submission as the definitive statement of its position, until it's formally changed.
Yes, that's certainly my position as well. I note there was also a question about whether or not there needs to be to distinguish between airport activities and non-airport activities. For my money's worth, I would prefer having them together, and that's how it was in the airport's submission. It seems overly complicated for such related activities, but nonetheless, Wellington Airport can live with that separation as per the joint witness statement.
Can I just clarify that? Did you say distinguish airport and non-airport, or?
Oh, sorry, it should be airport, so between airport activities and airport related activities. That's me typing very late last night.
The devil's advocate would say, because the council has, like I understand that you've said that the airport would accept it. If they're together, there's then a question as to whether there is the combined activity gets the more or less enabling plan provisions currently provided. Normally you would have the less enabling. So that presumably this is what you and Ms. Lester and Ms. O'Sullivan have already discussed, that you might end up worse off.
I don't actually think it would make a lot of difference, to be honest, but nonetheless, it's been agreed amongst the planners, and but if the panel was minded to go back to having them combined, then we could have another look at that.
That's fine. You got anything else to add? I had one question arising out of your submissions.
I've just got two more issues.
Two more issues.
So there was one in your questions, you were talking about sort of working around the designation and making sure that the designation was doing the heavy lifting, I think was your phrase. And there seems to be a concern that somehow that there could be a circumvention of what's happening at the airport. In response to that, I suppose I should say that the airport spent a lot of time and an awful lot of money getting the designations in place. And it's also gone to additional expense and resources to prepare and consult on a number of design guidelines and documents. It hasn't done that lightly. It is a requiring authority. It's already used the designation outline planning process as opposed to the rules, when in those circumstances it was a permitted activity for the activity and the earthworks. And the only thing that didn't comply was there was a dust rule in the district plan, and that was for the hillock removal. So that was done by ODP, and rather than go for resource consents, there have been a couple of changes to one of the designations. For example, the Miramar South designation. There's been a change to provide a different width for access, and there's been a change to provide for existing buildings on the site, and the acknowledgement that the conditions are quite prescriptive and that they weren't fit for purpose. So rather than going back to the zone provisions, the airport has chosen to make the designation right and use that outline plan process as it has always intended. And finally, I simply note that there aren't any submissions that seek the airport, that airport activities are not provided for in the zone. So that's what was notified. There's no submissions saying that shouldn't be there. So that is what it is, really. We're tinkering around the edges to a certain extent, but hopefully that gives you some reassurance that the airport is very serious about using its designations and will continue to do so where that's appropriate. But it can also foresee that in some circumstances there will be resource consent required for its activities or for its lessees' activities. So if there's no questions on that one, I've just got 2 more points before I finish.
Before you
I know, I'm just reading my notes.
2 more points.
So I'll just be really quick. So there's no major misfits with the designation. It can't be the same, obviously, because they're different kinds of documents. And it's probably the differences where that lay is that there are site-wide requirements, like accounting for carbon. You know, it's not really an activity by activity thing, or there might be a guideline required for landscaping. Again, that's a site-wide issue rather than a site-by-site issue. And finally, that's standard 3 in the clause 2, which we've been all talked about. I'll just note that the designation isn't limited in this way. So it's the designation talks about including that list and then excluding, for the avoidance of doubt, certain activities. So in my submission, there is no reason that you would not enable the same kind of activities as the designation and restrict it in this way. And I also note that because there's also the final clause which talks about limiting retail, but when you look at the list of the only list you can do on that zone or in that precinct, you wouldn't really have any associated retail with it, because it's things like catering and car parking and car hireage, and they just don't have any retail. So it seems a bit odd that you would have this list that then makes another clause of that pretty redundant. But Ms. O'Sullivan will we'll talk to you about that as well. So those are my submissions in response from day one.
One question. We'll talk to Ms. O'Sullivan about submission 3, subclause 2. But as a matter of principle, if we accepted her reasoning, do you agree that the standard, if the designation excludes activities, so too should the standard?
Yes. And when it was drafted, the 10%, which was the standard that we've come up with, is actually more onerous than the designation, because the designation only excludes those 2 things that, you know, one was the airside stuff, which can't happen there anyway because it's not airside. And also it was inconceivable that there would be a supermarket there. So, but those were the things that were worrying residents. So that's why those exclusions were put there to ease those concerns.
So it was.
So yes.
The one question I had about your submissions was about your 1.9, saying saying it's inevitable that resource consents will be made in reliance on the rules as opposed to the designation. I understand that. Quite apart from anything else, there are activities that aren't subject to designation. There's land that's not subject to designation. But it's the last bit, and hence the likelihood that at the very least technical non-compliances will come into play into the future. I didn't understand what you meant by that. Can you explain that?
So what I meant by that is some of those conditions in the designation are quite technical, and I suppose the Miramar South one was a particular width for an access way. It turned out that when the electric bus depot was put in that place, it didn't work. So that needed to be changed. Is that right, Joe? Yeah. And it's another example of it's definitely an airport related activity there, but it's not in the list. And that's the whole thing about a designation, is that you are in some respects imagining a future and a range of activities. So that's one example of a technical non-compliance. Another technical non-compliance was also Miramar South, where there was an existing building, which originally I think was assumed to be removed, but decided they could keep it and reuse it. It didn't comply with the setback. So there was a technical non-compliance. Didn't affect anybody because it was already there. But rather than doing it by way of resource consent, we did actually change the designation. So another technical example, but just a different way of dealing with it. And I suppose I'm just saying that there will be others like that. In my view, bearing in mind the history and what I know of other airport operations.
Is your position? I think that maybe what's puzzling me is that you're in effect saying that resource consents might be used as the mechanism if the airport company can't comply with the designation conditions.
Well, it might, depending on the nature of the application. So if it was a substantive thing, they will always go back to the designation. But sometimes in light of that, there might be a good reason for doing it. Another example might be when it is maybe a sign, for instance, which the airport is not doing. So therefore it's not covered by the designation, it is covered by the zone rules. So they just, and that does happen at airports because they put up signs that are owned by a company who lease the land. I'm not saying that it happens here, but I'm just trying to think of an example where that might happen.
And are you saying that like it's one thing to choose one process over another because designation and substantive changes to the designation are a much more onerous process than perhaps a minor shift that you that would slide through in a non-complying resource consent application. But in terms of the rules that apply, I think that what I was asking Mr. Jeffries about was whether the zone rules should be more enabling than the designation in any material way. And what's your answer to that question? Like I accept that like there will be issues at the margin of no account either way, but.
Well, I think it depends on the activity. I mean, obviously at the moment, that distinguishes between non-airport activities which are not covered by the designation, but still providing a flexible framework, given that the zone was quite enabling even before the designations, and those rules, seemed to work. So I suppose it's the answer to your question is that for airport-related activities and airport activities, it should be about the same as the designation, and for non-airport activities, it should be different, but not necessarily so different that it ties the airport campus up in knots.
Any other questions, colleagues?
Yeah. Good morning, Ms. Stewart, Ms. Lester, and Ms. O'Sullivan. I guess I've raised this issue of the designation and the heavy lifting issue as a sort of a panel inquiry early on, and most of my questions have been answered in this last dialogue, so that's good. I just wanted to recap on a couple of things. I just wanted to understand from your view what situations in terms of categories of situation, the airport might not be able to rely on the designation. And I socialised this in the earlier hearing, and I'd listed three. One where the activity is not within the purpose of the designation. The second one was where it might be within the purpose but doesn't meet the conditions attached to the designation, in the sense that the condition provided a bit of an umbrella to the designation. And the third might be where it's not the requiring authority undertaking the activity, and there may also be a fourth one, and well, I think there is, and it's where they're not airport activities per se.
I can think of a fifth one, not spatially within the area of the designation.
Yes, well, that was what I was going to say. So yes,
Yeah,
there's that obvious category,
Yeah.
which you've probably ignored because it's so obvious. But
No, I think I did mention it actually on day one of the hearing. So if that's the case, and given that the airport has done a lot of work to get the designation right, and is still doing that through presumably the 181 process that you've talked about.
Yep.
The question for me is, in a very broad sense, is what's the utility of having an airport zone? An airport zone that provides for airport activities and airport related activities, other than an airport zone that just provides for non-airport related activities. And that's a sort of a very wide Section 32 appropriateness question. I mean, I know the National Planning Standards talks about special purpose airport zones, and but is that in itself a reason to have an airport zone?
well, I think the history has shown that the underlying zone is important, and especially in Wellington, where not all it is designated. For instance, Rangito Ridge and parts of Bridge Street. So it is a bit of a moving feast with airports, and that's what we've trying to get across, and the evidence across these hearing streams. That for instance, going back to Miramar, wasn't contemplated at that stage that there'd be an electric bus depot there. Okay. So we could have been tied up if there hadn't been the word including in the purpose description. Yes. So I think it is a bit of a, you don't know what you don't know, and it's not a perfect system, but history has shown that it is important to have proper underlying zones. For Christchurch, for instance, it has designation with no conditions at all, but quite a heavily zone with lots and lots of rules, but they're designated with no conditions. Auckland's different again, and Ms. Chappell could talk you through those as well. She's much more familiar with them than I. And
of course, Wellington was the reverse prior to the proposed plan, a site that relied on the airport zone as opposed to, prior to the designations. Right. 5 years ago. Yes. And
that was found to be at times unworkable and painful. Which is why they invested that money to get those designations in place.
Yes. So what I've written down, that the underlying zone is important where the site's designated, but also where the site is not designated.
Yes.
And that's the spatial question, isn't it? Okay. Yeah. So given that, it's important, therefore, that the rules in the airport zone don't undermine the designation, presumably.
Yes.
One of the examples that you gave where the designation might not be able to be enabling was in relation to signage. Well, you're talking about third-party advertising, third-party signage as opposed to core signage associated.
Well, it could be a bit of both. Lots of these signs, in my experience, are now both. It's not just on-site stuff, it can be on-site and off-site. So you might have advertisements for things going on at the airport, but you might have community messages for festivals like you do here and like we do in Christchurch as well. So they do tend to be a hybrid, but the physical structure may be owned by a third party.
Yes.
And so there are agreements involved in that, but also doesn't fit nicely into a particular pot of a rule, and so that's why I think the flexibility is required for those types of circumstances.
Yes, and non-airport related activities, by definition, activities not undertaken by the airport company, or are they something else?
Well, it would be most unlikely that and by definition, it means an activity within the zone which is not an airport activity or an airport-related activity.
But it could be an activity still undertaken by Wellington International Airport.
Conceivably, I'm struggling to think what it could be, because even if Wellington Airport decided to open up a McDonald's, that would be an airport-related activity.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't even know whether that would fit within its own statutory framework. And I mean, obviously, it has a particular meaning in related legislation, and I'm not sure how that would work. But I can't help you. I can't think of an example where it would.
Okay, that's my only series of questions on that issue before we get into any specifics.
We're ready for Ms. Lester.
Right. So obviously, Ms. Lester has filed some original evidence, and so she's here to answer any questions that you might have. There were some questions about the what was going on Bridge Street in terms of heights. If you want her to go through.
I wonder if you should wait for the questions, and then if you think we haven't covered anything, you can tell us. Okay,
that sounds like a great way forward. Thank you, Ms. Lester.
Thank you, Ms. Lester. I had a limited number of questions of fact. About your evidence. Mainly about Bridge Street. So the first was about paragraph 4.4 of your evidence, replacement of your gas boiler. What are you replacing it with?
It's still under investigation at the moment. Massive project.
Yes, I was thinking that. If you had to guess, like to your mind, what is the leading option or options?
That's under the role of our sustainability manager. I'm sorry, so I don't know exactly what I haven't been involved in that project. It's more likely heat pump systems type things. I'm just looking for where they're getting the electricity from.
Like my assumption was that it would be electrical of some shape or description.
Yeah.
The next question I had was about 5.6. We referred to while owned road reserve, which seemed to me almost a contradiction in terms. Does the airport own the roads?
Well, we own like around Stuart Duff Drive up, so where the roundabout is with Broadway and Calibre Road and Stuart Duff Road, we own quite a bit of the road around that roundabout. The airport does.
Like
it looks like road reserve, but it's owned.
Like I should clarify. My understanding of a road reserve is that it's legal road.
Right.
Yes.
Yes, road margins, you mean?
Yes.
Rather than road reserve.
So Stuart Duff Drive is not a legal road. It is owned by the airport.
From the
roundabout.
From the roundabout with the
right through to Moa Point.
Yeah.
And so the areas around that roundabout that have some quite big billboards on it that people perceive as road reserve, but it's just on wild land. Yeah. So it's outside our operational area.
think I knew that because the golf course relies on a private agreement with the airport company for access to the club, its clubhouse.
Mhm.
The 5.9, you replied, short life PET radio pharmaceuticals. And I thought, so what are they?
That's sort of cancer treatment, radiology stuff. So those people have to, they have a big cyclotron there, which makes radioactive material that for cancer treatment, which needs to be in close proximity to the airport to fly off wherever they need to go. That particular radiation needs to go.
Now, about Bridge Street, I wasn't on, talking about 6.6, I wasn't on stream 5. Obviously, Commissioner Schofield was the chair of that hearing. Can you identify exactly where you're talking about? Like how much land? Well, I think I know what has been purchased, but what is the airport company's purchase plan? What are you aiming to purchase on Bridge Street above and beyond what you already own?
The properties along Bridge Street are in relation to our quieter homes program. So those houses that were along within a contour that those particular houses received in excess of 75 decibels on average. They were considered not viable to treat with insulation and things because you couldn't get it down to the internal noise level down to 45 decibels. So those programs, they're offered on an ongoing basis to purchase those houses when they wanted to sell. So it was a fair purchase program. And on terms of the eastern side of Bridge Street, we own the entire area except for one house, which is number 23 Bridge Street, which we're in discussions with the people there, just want to live out their life there. They've lived there all their life, so that's the one house on that side. On the opposite side of Bridge Street to the north end, where there are a few properties that come within that same category, I think we own 4 on that side of the street to the north. 3 of those have been converted to a community garden, which is in operation at the moment, and there's 7 other houses along there that have been offered that to be brought out when they want and if they want. We also own the area that used to be Gowden Street that was road stopped a couple of years ago.
What used to be?
Gowden Street, which is the little road that sort of went off Bridge Street in towards the airport.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah, so that's now airport owned land. Yeah, so there's like 8 more properties along there that are offered that their purchase program. The remainder of the houses along Bridge Street have been part of the Quieter Homes program, where they've been mitigated if they wanted against noise.
So we can produce a map of that description if you would like.
I think that would be helpful for my benefit. I suspect that Commissioner Schofield has the noise contour in his head and knows exactly where we're talking about, but I don't.
So if I refer to the supplementary evidence that's no longer supplementary,
Yeah.
and go to figure 5, paragraph 21, you will find that it just shows in a pictorial view the description that Ms. Lester has just given you.
Yes, I think if you provide that as a discrete document, please. And the question that I was puzzling over looking at the map in your evidence, as you talk about the need, the airport standards, international airport standards, the need to have a greater margin between the taxiway and the main runway. Does that mean that the main runway is at some point is going to be shifted to the my directions right to the west?
The runway, there's no intention of that. No, it's it'll
You
be
shift
probably
the taxiway in the opposite
could be
direction.
the taxiway. It could be. I think it's more getting that runway strip sorted, but that's absolutely beyond my expertise in that area. I just know that there's constraints around that.
So at the moment, the airport strip that have a dispensation for a lesser strip, and so over time the airport. This is from over time they are improving their compliance with international standards, and so there's no intention of. It's just making it more compliant. No intention of moving the runway. It's staying where it is. It's just making sure that there's better compliance with those international rules. And that's a very lay person's description, I might add.
Like like my reading of Ms. Lester's evidence was that the area of non-compliance was the distance between the taxiway and the airport's runway strip, which is currently 100 meters odd and should be 150. And that was the dispensation. Is that like other requirements that the airport is not in compliance with?
The runway are you talking about the runway taxiway separation or the runway strip itself?
No, the runway taxiway. Like that was what I had understood.
Yeah, at the moment we have a dispensation for that, which just is carrying on as far as we are aware of.
And,
but at some point in the future, we're not sure when, that we may have to be required to.
So there are two separate requirements. One is a separation between the runway and the taxiway, and then there's another requirement that talks about the total width of the runway strip, which includes everything.
And how much more? And how much more room? How much more room do you need? Like the runway strips?
For the runway strip. So the runway strip itself.
Like, yeah, with the margins, as you
yeah.
For airport runoff, basically.
Yes, it is. So it's at the moment we need, well, the extent of it goes out to we've measured out to the road boundary of Bridge Street on that side. So the runway strip itself, which is 140 metres from the centre of the runway line that we have at the moment, and that goes out to the road boundary of Bridge Street.
The western boundary.
The western boundary, and it goes out to Calibre Road on the eastern boundary.
Trying to make sense of that, and thinking, well, there are those properties show where looking at right. I think I'll just yes. I've tried to figure out how this worked because it's that industrial land, Cairn Street, which sort of sticks out towards the and like the Bridge Street properties that you purchased effectively ran to the eastern margin of Cairn Street and Jean Batten Street. Will that remain so that that Bridge Street's like an inset, which is giving you more room, but it seemed to me that there seems to be a fundamental problem that unless and until you can shift, purchase, demolish the properties on north of Cairn Street on the eastern margin, and pull everything back to Bridge Street, there's always going to be an issue there. Is that right?
Yeah. Oh, although I think the runway strip, I don't think it goes exactly right to the end of the runway because there's a runway end safety area that's within a patch there, and that's sort of more adjacent to those industrial properties on Cairn Street. But yeah, there is probably a margin within there that would be within our runway strip. All currently below that level.
And lastly, Ms. Weber showed us photos about the difference in level between Bridge Street and the runway strip. Is it the airport's intention in the fullness of time when it owns all those properties to remove or shift that level different? In effect, it's like looks like a flood stop bank, but obviously for a different purpose. Is it your intention to fill that land so it's the same level?
It'd be one of the only feasible activities that we could do along there because of the runway strip requirements. So yes, there'd probably be earthworks along there.
And in terms of the OLS, again, I wasn't in the relevant hearing, so I haven't had the benefit of the detailed explanation of how it works. I mean,
I haven't actually had that hearing yet. It's the designation later on.
You had
yes, we've had discussions. Yeah,
a preliminary go round in Stream 4. Because of that, the concern that Ms. Weber was expressing on behalf of herself and the organisation she represented was the potential for the airport company to build large unsightly buildings on that. which in my understanding would clearly breach the OLS. That in that, to the extent that she was seeking a precinct that, and I understand that the airport company objects to, basically saying no structures. Does the airport company have a problem in principle limiting the height of structures in that area along Bridge Street? If so, why?
The airport is quite limited in what the height that it can go there. That runway strip is not the OLS, that's the runway strip, which is the extent of it is where the OLS radiates out from.
I gotcha.
So within that area, the only thing that is allowed to penetrate is navigational aids. That's it. The airport would never ever build anything to go through that runway strip area. So in terms of heights along there, the maximum that anything could be built, and that would be right at the edge of the road in the lowest part of Bridge Street, would be 7 metres. So it would range from between 0 and 7 metres, because of the slope of the land there. To the north of where Gowden Street used to be, that area is higher land. It's also has a constraint on our instrument landing system. So there's a navigational aid in that vicinity that any buildings or buses or anything that goes or moves along there can produce glare, which can affect that instrument landing system. So we'd have to do an aeronautical assessment for anything in and around there as well. And that area only has probably about 2 metres clearance up to the runway strip itself, 2 or 3 metres. We had to even stop Transit, who own a bus depot to the north of that, from parking their buses along there because it was producing glare and affecting that navigational aid along there, because although they can be correlated around things, temporary objects like long buses, you couldn't correlate around. So we had to stop them from parking along there and moving constantly. So down the area where it is not designated, to the sort of mid-south end of Bridge Street, that's where the land towards the runway, it's probably, there's 0 height there, and it would, at the maximum, as I said before, be about 7 metres. Comparing that to the character of the area across the road on the residential properties, they're allowed up to 11 metres of height as of right under the new rules. So yeah, we would not be able to build a big huge building along Bridge Street.
Well, I suppose the underlying question for me is, do you have a problem if the plan says that? That you said 7 metres is the maximum you could build. If the plan said that the maximum height of any structure other than a navigational aid in that area is 7 metres, would you have a problem with that?
It's just, yeah, we're just trying to safeguard for the airside activity. So
I need to get some instructions about that.
It's like
from the
calling a spade. I understand you need to get instruction before you could commit, but if the answer is no, it wouldn't accept it, that's contradicting the evidence that Ms. Lester is giving us, and therefore I'll be interested to know why.
Yeah, I think.
But as I say, in formal terms, I understand completely. You need to get instructions, so we'll take that as a given.
Yeah.
But if the answer is no, I want more than no. I want to know exactly why.
And are you suggesting that would be for buildings?
Buildings or structures,
Buildings or
other
structures.
other than navigational
Other-
aids, which as Lester told us, is an exception to the what is the source of these requirements? It's some sort of
Kaya.
yeah, I knew it was an acronym, but I just
International.
couldn't remember what it stood for.
Yeah.
International Civil Aviation Organisation, which is the international rules that are permeated down through all the different civil aviation authorities worldwide.
Now, do you have any questions for Ms. Lester?
Yes, I do, and I'll try and get them brief, Ms. Lester. Three issues. The first, and I apologise if I've asked for this in another forum, but it would be really useful to see a graphic that shows the difference between the airport zone and the airport designations.
Mhm.
If that's as simple as showing the areas that are not designated within the airport zone, then that's fine. But
Would you like to see the figure 4 in my supplementary that is not accepted as supplementary, which outlines
I
that?
think the solution to that is to provide that as a question. Yeah, at a scale that's useful.
Yeah.
The second thing is, and I'll put this question to Ms. O'Sullivan, but just from your experience and your time at the airport as the airport planning manager, how would you categorise the main difference between the airport zone that exists in the operative district plan and the airport zone that's part of the proposed district plan? What, from a practical day-to-day operational and planning perspective, are there any key differences that you would point this panel to?
Between the operative and the proposed?
Yes.
Ignoring our designations?
Yes. Just focusing on the zone itself.
I
mean, Ms. O'Sullivan can point to key rules that are different, but from an operational point of view, what are the main things that you now need to take into account where the zone's engaged?
Yes.
That you didn't previously, or vice versa?
I haven't really found out yet. We've been using our designations so far. The only areas that where the zone would come into play would be that part of Bridge Street, I guess, and the Rongotai Ridge precinct. The remainder is all designated.
Okay.
Many of the provisions in the proposed plan copied the designation provisions, so yeah, I haven't had a need to try and utilise them.
Okay, that in itself is interesting. So the model for the airport zone in the proposed plan was more the designation as opposed to the former airport zone.
Yes, it was, and that was about the timing of when our designations were going through mediation and the timing of when the proposed district plan was notified. It was all at the same time.
Yes.
So it was very difficult for the writer at the time to reconcile the differences at that time.
Okay. Well, my final question, and it's just to give some example of where the designation, and the zone rules perhaps conflict. And you talked about Miramar South with the electric bus depot. There was the Hillock example, which I presume is in the east.
The Hillock was in the terminal precinct.
This is in the terminal, okay,
Yeah.
thank you. And then the fire station, is that in the west precinct?
The fire station is in the western precinct.
Yes.
So there's different zonings around there in the proposed district plan compared to the operative district plan. So a resource consent was required for the proposed.
Okay, well, let's deal with those one by one. With the Miramar South, with the electric bus terminal, would just take me through why the designation couldn't be relied on there and what the process was.
The first issue with that was the location of the access, the egress access from Cowrie Street was a little bit too close to the intersection with Broadway. So buses couldn't safely turn out of the site, turn onto Cowrie Street and then turn right to get to the airport
So there
from
was a
there.
condition.
So it was just, we had to move it a little bit. And the rules the conditions on the designation stated that the access had to be across the road from centre zoned properties.
Yes.
We had to move it across the road from a non-residential use, but it was zoned residential property.
What was the remedy?
We applied for an alteration to the designation.
Change that condition.
Change that condition so
Yeah.
that it was residentially used properties
Yeah.
instead of
And
zoned.
then was there an outline plan process or an outline plan waiver? What happened?
Then we applied for an outline plan after that for the stage 1 of the development of
Okay.
that Miramar South site.
Yes. Okay. Understand that. And for the hillock, which is in the terminal,
Mhm.
What was the situation there?
We just applied for an outline plan for that, for
Okay.
the removal of the hillock.
So you could work within the designation there. There wasn't any, no for a section 181.
No.
Okay. And the fire station, is that's not covered? Is that covered by the airport zone at all?
It's covered
Proposed.
in a proposed airport zone when resource consent was applied for in 2020. That was partly residential, partly airport zoned.
Yes. Okay. And designated?
It's designated now.
Yeah. Okay. And so what was the planning mechanism for that? Was it an outline plan?
That was a resource consent,
It
but it
was
was prior to the designations.
Of course.
Yeah.
Okay. And that was assessed in terms of a split zoning.
Yes,
Okay. And was it not notified? Notified? What was it?
non-notified.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Go ahead, Councillor.
Of clarification questions regard to Bridge Street. What's the story of the properties at the bottom end of Bridge Street on Cootes Street that are near the runway?
Do you mean on the northern side?
Off Cootes Street?
They're not owned by WOW.
They're not owned?
No.
And no proposal to try and own them?
They've had offers under sort of master planning, ongoing offers, but it's more.
They would come.
Ideally, the airport would like to own those, but we don't. And I don't think many of those owners want to sell at this stage.
Well, can you just hold on to?
Yeah.
We'll have a look at a map so I understand where you're talking.
Yeah. Residential. Used for residential. Just fine.
On Cootes Street.
Designated.
Some sort of like.
And the properties the airport is buying on the western side of Bridge Street as
Mhm.
Is there a long-term plan for those? Are they going to come within a tighter precinct?
There's no long-term plan at the moment.
Would just be rental properties?
No, we'd remove that because they come within that 75 decibel contour. They're considered under the land use lumens project. That they're not fit for residential use. They receive too much noise. So we remove them from residential use.
Right.
So where were those properties you were talking about?
Figure 5, it's been tabled in response to our questions.
Will be.
Page 7, and the next page. That one.
On the other side. Yeah.
So the buildings would be removed.
Yes.
And on the other side to those properties, sort of green tone, is that where your community gardens?
So no, the community gardens is on the left side of that. It's the larger of the wire-owned properties there. The green part is the area that is designated, always been zoned airport.
And just finally, just to clarify a response you gave to the chair around the Bridge Street properties on the runway side of Bridge Street. Are you saying the airport is looking at the option of filling that in from the height, from the runway edge down to the street?
I think it would be a slow process of earthworks along there when there's available clean fill.
Because you wouldn't want a plane to suddenly go off.
No, it's not the intention.
Like my assumption was, if the whole point was to provide airport runoff, the last thing you need is a 2-metre drop. No, but I will be interested to hear about the conferencing results. Well, I think that might be it, Ms. Lester. Before we go on to Ms. O'Sullivan, one question, one point for you. Thank you for your offer of a site visit. As I asked the hearing administrator to pass back the message that we'd think about it afterwards. We understand that as soon as you take people airside, there are a veritable mountain of health and safety issues that you need to address. What we are going to do is, immediately following the conclusion of this hearing, we're going to meet and have a preliminary discussion about what we've heard, and among other things, identify what particular issues we might be assisted by the reporting officer replying on. We will also discuss at that point whether we would be assisted by a site visit to the airport. I think that given where the extent to which the issues have been narrowed, it would be a targeted site visit if we wanted a site visit at all. And but to give you a preliminary heads up, it would need to be on the afternoon of the 4th of April, which is when we are reforming. But as I say, we will discuss whether we think, given the nature of the issues still in contention, which are pretty narrow, whether we think that we know enough, and because obviously we don't need your assistance to cruise down Bridge Street and have a look, so we'll let you know within a day or two whether we would like to take you up on that offer. And as I say, it would need to, if we do, it would need to be the afternoon of the 4th of April. But I imagine I'll be in a position to give you that message tomorrow at latest.
That's fine. All it is actually is you just need to send me a passport photo and your ID, and I send it through to aviation security and they issue temporary passes to go on site. So that's it. It's not too much health and safety.
Well, not from your point of view, at least.
And then you'll be driven.
Yes, indeed. We won't be strolling around the airport taxiway unaccompanied. I understand.
Thank you.
We're now up to Ms. O'Sullivan, and I wonder if she's going to plug in now. And Ms. O'Sullivan, welcome to this happy gathering. I think that we're open to you to give any preliminary comments you want, but we would be assisted if you take us through the track changed version of plan provisions that you provided this morning in particular. So over to you.
Yeah, okay, cool. Okay, so thank you. So everybody has a copy, I'm assuming you've got one in front of you with page numbers at the bottom.
Yep.
Great. Okay, so I just need to make a correction on that front page where it says blue underline and strike out for further additions and deletions that were noted in my evidence in chief in Appendix B. It's actually Appendix A. So just don't want you rummaging through my evidence trying to find a Appendix B that doesn't exist. Okay, so if you turn to page 2 to the introduction section. So Red is the section 42A officers recommended amendments, and blue is my further recommended amendments that are either set out in Appendix B or in response to some of the questions that have been raised by the panel. I will go through these so you'll know which one fits into which category.
Can I just, while you're on that particular page, can I just ask you a question? I should have asked Mr. Jeffries, but since I forgot, then I'll ask you. I thought it was quite curious in the introduction to say while holds a given number of designations and then say these include 1 through either 4 or 5, because that suggests there are others. Is include the right word? Should it be these are?
Yes, that is a very good point. And include really is not the correct word in that context. So yes, yeah, I take your point. It was just poor drafting. It wasn't anything untoward.
Yeah, well, I surmised that. Yeah, I just,
Yeah.
I thought you would be well aware of how many designations while it holds.
So then those changes that I've got in there, it's just flagging the first one. So where we talk about the designations and the striking out of while 3, that's just flagging changes that will happen via the designations hearing. Don't necessarily need to, I think, labour that point at all today, because whatever happens during the designation hearing will have to be reflected in back in this chapter.
So that deletion is subject to the recommendations in stream 10.
Yeah, so I understand that the designation, that while 3 designation has been subsumed by the main site area designation, so that that while 3 is no longer required or necessary. So that'll be formally addressed and withdrawn via that hearings process as appropriate.
Understand, thank you.
So then moving down to the blue text that you can see that sits above the heading airport precincts. There was an issue that was raised, I think it was during hearing stream 3, and we flagged it at that time, and it will be addressed during the infrastructure chapter. But at the moment, the infrastructure chapter does not apply to the airport zone, and there's some relationship issues between that chapter and this chapter. So these changes here are just trying to address that relationship issue. Again, that'll be something that will no doubt be tidied up, or hopefully tidied up during the infrastructure hearing, and then that will need to be reflected back in these provisions. So again, it's just another flagging the changes there. No questions on that? I'll keep moving on.
I'll just ask a question. Why is there a need to sort of highlight including subchapters in that paragraph?
Yeah, so it comes down to whether it's clear or not in the infrastructure chapter, because it's a chapter with subchapters, and it's not immediately clear to me if that's one chapter or if they are separate chapters. So it's just, if it's really clear that infrastructure chapter includes all of the subchapters, then you won't need that subsequent reference.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm just going to, because we're working through, I'm going to use, because the airport precincts heading is there, I'm just going to use this as the opportunity to respond to some of the questions that came up about the use of the term precinct in the zone. And I think that the use of the word precinct is probably a bit of a quirk of history. Under the operative plan, the airport area is called the Airport and Golf Course Precinct. The designation uses the word precincts to describe the different areas, but in the
can you say that again? Sorry, I missed the first part.
Oh, sorry. In the operative plan, the entire airport area, the chapter heading is actually called the Airport and Golf Course Precinct. Then, if I stick with the operative plan, the different areas that are identified, there are additional areas that are now identified in the proposed plan, but in the operative plan, the kind of different areas like Rongotai Ridge and South Coast, etc. Those are called development areas in the operative plan. And then the designation, of course, uses the term precincts. So since the operative plan was drafted, of course, we now have New Zealand planning standards that have different use of the words precinct and development areas. So I've had a look at the national planning standards and the use of that term precinct. And I don't think that the use of the term precinct is necessarily inconsistent with the NZ planning standards. The planning standard talks about a precinct being spatially, it talks about a precinct as spatially identifying and managing an area where additional place-based provisions apply to modify or refine aspects of the policy approach or outcomes anticipated in the underlying zones. So that's table 18 of the planning standards. The front end of the proposed plan, however, does define precincts and how they work in the context of that plan, and it does suggest that some precincts will have objectives, policies and or rules that apply to them. So of course there isn't a distinct set of objectives, policies necessarily that apply to these different precincts. What I have noted though is that this plan also uses the term specific control areas, and it defines those as specific controls. A specific control spatially identifies where a site or area has a provision that is different from the other spatial layers or district-wide provisions that apply to that site or area. And I wonder if in this particular context, what has been referred to in this chapter as precincts may actually be more aptly defined as a specific control area or an area. I note that the waterfront zone uses specific control areas. 2 of them do have objectives and policies associated with them, and rules, obviously, methods. 1 of them doesn't. So that may be a better fit for this particular zone if the panel doesn't think that the use of the term precinct is appropriate.
The other example is that in the residential zones, there are specific height control areas which don't have discrete objectives and policies, as far as I can recall. So we'll see what Mr. Jeffries thinks of that suggestion. I think that the point, as you would have heard, I understand that it is a quirk of history that the planning standards, the combination of the planning standards and how the plan describes precincts just waiting. Back again. Well, welcome back, Ms. Sullivan. What I was saying was it does seem to be a quirk of history. The way the planning standards, you could maybe jimmy this into the planning standards, but there are issues like the fact that these precincts are not labelled as required by the planning standards. They're not in the E-plan maps. Maybe they should be. Well, what's your question? What's your view? Whether we call them precincts or specific control areas, do you think they should be in the E-plan maps?
It certainly would be more consistent with the planning standards to do that, because then it makes it clearer. You know, the whole purpose of the E-plan is that you can click on a property and see where you sit, and that includes, you know, whether you're in a specific control area or a specific control area within a zone. So I think it would be more beneficial, though it isn't essential because it is at the end of the chapter. Just want to apologise as well for dropping out there. My laptop went to sleep.
You get that. Well, I think that you want to ask a question?
Yeah, just a related question. Mr. Sullivan, I'm taking notes as you speak. Where do we find the reference to specific control areas?
Oh, it's in the front end of the proposed plan. If you,
Oh, okay.
Like the one that says how the plan is.
how the plan works. Yeah,
How
that
the
it's in
plan
that kind
works.
of, yeah, it might be that one.
Thank you. That's good. I'm sure I can find that from there. And this is a very minor point, but if you look at the top of page 3 in the red, the word include is used in the second line. I presume, based on your answer, that should be are also as opposed to include.
Correct. Okay, so if I keep moving through, so I'll move on to page 3. The blue changes, and actually the same applies. So the blue changes for the East Side precinct and then the South Coast precinct. Those are just really changes around clarity and providing further information around what the intended use of the zone, or not the zone, the precinct is. I'm going to keep using the word precinct just for the sake of simplicity. So those are just really around clarity. Those particular amendments in blue on page 3 and page 4. If we move down page 4, I have inserted the new heading airport noise. That is from the panel recommendation for hearing stream 5. Apologies, that was not included in earlier versions. Yeah, that was purely just an oversight. Forgot that was addressed at that particular hearing, so that has been popped in there to reflect that recommendation. If we move across to hearing stream 5, sorry, not hearing stream 5, page 5. Under the heading Other Relevant District Plan Provisions, that is just some further explanatory text that I recommended, and that's to clarify that relationship between the designation and the zone chapter. This came up quite a bit during the noise hearing to make sure that people understand where the airport's obligations are with respect to the management of noise. So that's why there was some of that text included earlier, to make sure that the community understands that it's managed under designation. This is just kind of following on from that, just to make sure that it's really clear to people where that relationship sits and how those two mechanisms, I guess, planning mechanisms work.
Just for clarification, who are the other requiring authorities with designations over the airport zone? I suppose it might be Airways. The Airways corporations might have one.
Yeah,
Met
Ms. Resta might be able to answer that off the top of her head.
It's Met Service.
Oh,
So,
yes.
Does that include Mother Point, the sewage plant there, the wastewater plant?
Oh yeah, there's a bit of crossovers there at the moment. So yes, there's the wastewater one at that southern precinct, within that southern precinct.
Met Service and WCC.
Airways
Wellington,
do have,
or
they
whatever.
did have them over, but I think they've removed those designations now.
Say again.
Airways did have some
Okay.
visual ones over the airport, but I think they've removed them.
And to the extent that those overlap, which is the primary designation?
That would be for the wastewater. The wastewater treatment plant has the primary designation. It was there first, but once that sludge minimisation project is complete, we'll be reconciling all of that through an alteration to our designation.
And Met Service?
That's just, that will be primary for, that was there first. That's an aid on the side of the runway.
So once the sludge treatment goes, does that mean that the overlap will be removed, or?
We will be reconciling those, yes.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Ms. Lester, could you indicate that on the graphic that I asked, that area that's covered by the wastewater designation?
Yes.
Yeah. Who's the requiring authority there? Is it Wellington Water?
It's
Wellington City.
City Council.
Wellington
Yeah.
City. Okay.
Okay, so if we move on to page 6, which is the next area of blue text, and this relates to the airport objective 2. This is that objective where there was a bit of discussion around how do you define the areas for which the airport needs to make sure that it manages those visual amenity effects for buildings and the likes. It reads a little clumsy, what I have written there, the adjacent public space land. Now the reason...
Don't apologise that it's clumsy, because you adopted my language. You can blame me.
The reason, I think yours is a little bit more eloquent. I think it was open space land. The reason it's public space land is the term public space is actually defined in the proposed plan, and it kind of addresses a lot of these areas like reserves and roads and the like. So it seems like it's a much more efficient way of expressing the areas that need to be considered. So that's how I landed on the use of the term public space land, adjacent public space land.
With
Okay.
the definition, sorry, just one question there. With the definition of public space land, I don't know if you know off by hand, but does that include roads?
Correct. Yeah, it does. Sorry, the definition's public space, not public space land. The land is the additional part by myself.
And it includes roads.
Correct.
Thank you.
So moving down to the objective 5, I've heard the panel's comments around, well, there isn't really an action without using the word options. Just allows the airport to think about a lot of options that they could consider. So the submission originally had the terminology operations, so I have just included in there that use of that term operations. So that kind of suggests that there needs to be that uptake in those options. Sorry, in those operations. Okay, so moving through to page 7, airport character policy 4. So this remains an area of disagreement between Mr. Jeffries and I, and that reference to the centres and mixed-use design guides. So I understand via the certification process that Wellington Airport has had to use for its designations, it has worked in with Wellington City Council and received feedback on what they look like. And the feedback that they have received from the council around that has been that these guidelines need to be specific to the airport and that they can't be generic. And that's in recognition of the fact that it is an operational environment with unique characteristics. Ms. Webber has also last week suggested that she doesn't think that it's appropriate to refer to the intent of the centres and mixed use guides. And then I just question whether it is appropriate for a design guide that has been promulgated for quite a different zone to then be referenced in the policy around airport character. It seems to me that's not really a particularly good fit. I also note that the airport hasn't actually had any input into the development of those guidelines, and perhaps if it had known that it was going to be included in the policies, it may have sought to be involved in that particular process. So I maintain that it's not appropriate for that reference to be there in that airport policy 4, Lim 2. And I think that the reference in subparagraph 3 is more appropriate because it ties developments back to the various guides and management plans, etc., that the airport has produced.
And those landscape plans, urban design principles, integrated design management plans will have been prepared under the conditions of the designations, one or more designations.
Correct, yeah. They all use different terminology, which is why they are slightly different, referred to differently there. And those go through a certification process, and they go through a consultation process with the community as well. There were some questions during the opening around the reference to some precincts in this policy and not others. I have had a look at that. I do think it is intentional to do that. I note the operative plan includes some policies that relate to some precincts, but not all precincts. And those are precincts where there are additional characters or features that need to be considered, as well as, you know, just the kind of zone interface type matters. So, for example, I'll use Rongotai Ridge because it's an easy one to use. It's an elevated site. It has visual and landscape significance, or I say significance, but it's not a significant area, but it has prominence. So that's why there's a slightly different focus, I guess, or an additional focus in that particular area.
Mr. O'Sullivan, again, just a clerical thing, that P4 also uses the word precinct and precincts, as you just outlined, so presumably that would change to specific control area. Yes, correct. I probably would consolidate that down, so maybe not specific control area, just area. I haven't gone through and amended that throughout, as I'm not sure if the panel's appetite for such a change, and it makes it look like there are a lot more changes in the chapter than there really is. But in the event that we did adopt that change, that for consistency, the word precinct should be swapped out for some other term. Correct.
Yes. Okay, so moving down to policy 5, I have struck out in limb 1 the words and associated public and private effects. I just don't think it's necessary in this particular policy. It's inherent within the chapeau of the policy, so that's why I removed it. With respect to the blue text there, which does not appear to be underlined, my apologies for that, where it says construction activity. What I have tried to do throughout the chapter is, where it refers to construction, make sure it's construction activity. And the reason for that is there are other chapters in the plan that deal with the other elements of construction activity. So construction activity is a defined term. But then if you are interested in things like noise or earthworks, temporary activities, there are separate chapters that deal with those. And once you're looking at the zone provisions, if you're in a resource consent status, you're also looking at the district-wide chapters of the plan. So that's why throughout here I have included activity after the word construction.
What, Mr. Sullivan, what's the architecture of the plan for defined terms? Is it italics or colours, or?
I cannot recall actually off the top of my head.
Yeah, but presumably the word, if construction activities are a defined term, it should be in both words should be coloured or shown in some way. Blue is the colour. So, okay.
Yes, and I should clarify, I haven't italicised terms in here where they are defined in the plan.
No, but if blue is the colour, I can understand why activities blue and not underlined necessarily, but presumably construction should be blue as well.
Well, there's a different colour blue to distinguish.
Yeah.
Yes, I see. So like a hyperlink type blue.
Yes. Yeah. So that's.
So then there's that on that same point. You'll see at the bottom of the page under Airport Rule 1, 2. I've got the addition of the word activity in there as well. So are we ready to move on to page 8?
Like one thing that occurs to me I understand the rationale for distinguishing between construction activities. Do we need to start worrying at this point about whether we have scope to make that change? Given that we have left the relatively enabling blanket of the ISPP, where we could make out of scope requirements, and we now need to be careful about whether we have submissions authorising such changes.
I will just we may need to look at that scope matter to see.
Like, I wonder if we should park that, like, and I think that what I should ask between you and Ms. Dewar is to give us version, I think we might be up to version 4 of this document. Give us another version with a cross-reference to what submission, and because Weil had a huge submission, like what part of Weil's submission, because I don't imagine you're relying on anyone else's submission, but that may, like, if given that we're talking technical scope, it wouldn't matter whose submission it was as long as there is one. If I could ask you to give us a marked up version of this with in the margin or by a footnote or however, but distinguished for any additional changes that you're recommending, where the scope for that change is coming from.
Yeah, and there will be some greys in that, just because of you know, for instance, there weren't as many objectives in the Wellington Airport submission. Now there's an extra objective, so that sort of makes that scope issue a bit more difficult. But we'll do our best, and when we say it's consequential or alternative, we'll say that.
If you maybe a marginal comment might be better, saying, like, if you're deriving saying consequential on submission for X, then that's all we need to know. We can go and look at it, and Mr. Jeffries can give us a view as to whether he takes issue with whether there's a scope problem. So we'll just take that, if we could take that as a given, that you'll come back to us, and we'll just look at the merits of what you're proposing today.
Okay, cool. Okay, so if we come over the page, everybody's ready to page 8. So this is a tidy up. Mr. Jeffries had signalled in the joint witness statement that Mr. Jeffries would go through and do this. As I am presenting this post the joint witness statement and pre the right of reply, I've obviously had an attempt to do that. So the strikeouts that you can see in Airport Rule 2, those blue strikeouts are because Airport Standard 3 doesn't actually relate to the terminal precinct. So I've struck that out because nothing engages with those particular standards for the terminal precinct. Similar to that, Airport Rule 2.3, if there's no standards that are engaged, well, there are standards, but they relate to buildings. So if there's no activity standards that are engaged in the airport precinct, then that limb A needs to be removed. So it's a mix amendment.
Well, I'm sure Mr. Jeffries is grateful for you undertaking that, so all he needs to review what he says.
So if we turn to page, excuse me, page 9, you can see that there go in Rule 3 the conferenced provisions for non-airport activities. There was the discussion in Mr. Jeffries' rebuttal around the east side area and whether I had considered the fact that that was not technically airport zone prior to the proposed plan. And then the other one that has been brought to our attention is Miramar South is in that same category. So I had done quite a broad brush non-airport activities rule, and I acknowledge that those areas do have a slightly different framework under the operative plan, and now we're moving into the proposed plan. So that's why there is a different status there now for the Miramar South area in the east side precinct. That's obviously my take on that. If I can just respond to some questions raised this morning around non-airport activities and what type of activities might occur in those areas. I was trying to think of examples, and I think that medical cyclotron that Joe mentioned is a good example of a non-airport activity. It needs to be located at the airport. I understand what they produce has a half-life, so it needs to get onto planes quickly and into its destination. So it's a good fit, I guess, in terms of a non-airport activity. It really needs to be as close as possible to the airport, but it isn't an airport activity. So that's probably a useful example of a non-airport activity.
The other thing is that I imagine residential neighbours might get quite excited about having a medical facility producing radioactive material over their fence. So there are a limited number of locations from that perspective also.
Is that a question or was that an observation? I was thinking about other examples from non-airport activities at other airports that I've done work with, and one of the ones that immediately sprung to mind was, for example, the Toy Museum at Wanaka Airport. That's not an airport activity. So, you know, that if they were like Wellington Airport was going to establish a museum or something like that for passengers who are trying to pass time at the airport, that type of activity I would envisage would be more in that non-airport activity category rather than an airport-related activity.
It's like the flower garden at Changi Airport.
Just in regards to the non-airport activities, and that rule 1, oh sorry, it says rule 1 in my table, but that should be rule 2. There's an incorrect numbering there. So restricted discretionary activity status should be number 2, and the discretionary activity status should be number 3. Those matters of discretion, I have looked back at the operative plan to see how the matters of discretion there work, and they relate to things like building design, external appearance, siting, traffic generation, etc. So those matters of discretion are either addressed in other chapters of the plan, or they're generally captured by policies 3, 4 and 5. And I'd actually say that they're captured in a more comprehensive way by policies 3, 4 and 5. So if we step over to page 10.
Just a question of clarification. In rule 3, restricted discretionary, can you, I may be in need of a coffee, but where it says where the activity is a non-airport activity outside those precincts in Miramar South, what does that mean? Can you just explain an activity outside those precincts? Does that mean anywhere other than those in precincts, all the other precincts?
So so it's to create that carve out. So essentially Miramar South and East side addressed in that discretionary rule.
Okay.
Or could it be that is not within? Might be.
Yep, it's another option.
Thank you.
Okay, so turning page to page 10, under rule 4, which relates to buildings, rule 2, matters of control. The struck out text there in 4 again relates to, and 5 actually for that matter, but all relate to other chapters of the plan. So that's why I've struck those out from there. The same logic applies for number 3 at the bottom of page 10. if everybody is ready to move on, the next area of blue text is page 12, and it relates to Standard 2, the maximum height and location of buildings and structures in the Miramar South Precinct and Rongotai Ridge. This is one where I may have to check the scope for this, but that reference to a roof height greater than 9 metres, that is a bit of an odd reference when I think about how I usually see height restrictions and standards. If it's restricted to a roof height greater than 9 metres, it would appear that if you have a structure that doesn't have a roof, then there's no height control limits on it, as an example. So that's why that particular text is struck out. I will check the scope on that particular element as well. So then we get into S3, which is one of the matters outstanding from conferencing between Mr. Jeffries and I. Ms. Stewart has, sorry, I'm on S3.2 here. Ms. Stewart raised this morning, and it's my view as well, that the designation, the Miramar South designation, isn't limiting in the way that it is expressed here. It talks about essentially the types of activities, and then it has a clause that says that for the avoidance of doubt it will exclude, and it lists about 4 or 5 activities. Of 4 of those activities, which I can tell you what they are if you would like me to, I do have the designations to my right here, but 4 of those activities need airside access, so they're not going to establish on this site. The 5th one relates to large format retail. I have not proposed a large format retail standard in here because there is standard 5, which has arguably a more limiting constraint on retail activities. However, equally, I'm quite comfortable with a large format retail type exclusion going into the rules. I would suggest that probably would need to go into the rules though, rather than a standard, because it seems a bit odd for a standard to constrain activities when that's usually something that happens in the rules themselves. Any comments or questions, or should I move on?
No, I have a question. So the 4 activities that are referenced in the designation conditions that all need airside access, are they, presumably they're activities other than those in 2A to E?
They are not listed in 2A to D, A to E. They are, I've got them here: aircraft operations, runways, taxiways, traffic control structures, aircraft hangars.
Okay, can you just read them again more slowly?
Sorry.
Aircraft operation.
Aircraft operations,
Yes.
runways,
Yes.
taxiways, traffic control structures, and aircraft hangars.
So that's the other 4 activities that the designation excludes.
Excludes, correct.
Yeah.
And I have not sought to amend the rules to exclude those activities because practically they can't establish there because they need that airside access.
Yes. Right. So the activities in A to E are provided for by the designation, aren't they?
Correct.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Designation does not constrain only to those activities.
Oh, okay.
Okay, and then my last, I know this will be definition, apologies. Whilst there isn't any tracking on page 13 that relates to the access restrictions, given that there has been movement on anything that relates to access moving to the transportation section, I do wonder whether this standard would actually be better placed in the transportation section. That's just a comment. If that's the drafting style that is adopted for this chapter, then this is probably a good candidate for going into the transportation chapter.
Before you go on, Sullivan, I wondered, I know it's in the JWS, but looking at 5 as you of S3 that you as you redrafted it,
Mhm.
is the but surplus to requirements?
Yes.
And could it say 10% of the gross floor area of what?
Yeah, the gross floor area is defined, and that just describes what it's referring to when they talk about gross floor area. So it's buildings. So you could include the word buildings, but it is also referred to in the definition itself.
So basically, if it's not qualified, it's read of 10% of the gross floor area of the building. The way the definition would work would be 10% of the gross floor area of the building within which it's located.
Correct. Yeah.
Sure.
And if I just jump to the definitions, there is some blue in those definitions. Those are incorrectly coloured. And the definition of airport-related activities, those should be purple. Apologies for that. You'll notice at the end of that definition too, we've included that statement around making sure that it's clear that airport-related activities do not include those activities that are listed in the airport activities definition. And then the obstacle limitation surface. Sorry, this was an amendment made late last night that should not be struck out on the left, the term obstacle limitation surface, because as you can see, I've inserted some preliminary drafting there around what that could be defined as, given the comments raised by Ms. Webber. I still maintain that the notified definition was too oversimplified, essentially, the designation. So if there needs to be a definition, it should probably just refer, in my view, the reader to the designation itself. And that's what I have sought to do through that amendment at the bottom of page 16.
Well, thank you, Ms. O'Sullivan. Having got the less than subtle message from Commissioner to my left that he's suffering from caffeine withdrawal, we'll have we'll try for a 10-minute break and then come back and ask you any questions that occur to us. So we'll be back at 11:05.
Okay, great.
We'll try to. We'll resume the hearing. I suspect we may just be tweaking things that make sure we've covered everything. At least that's the position for me, Ms. O'Sullivan, but we'll just see what I've.
No, so you're looking, can I ask a question?
Certainly.
It's a semantic one. It's just language. The description of East Side Precinct, you're proposing adding a sentence there. Over time, the area will be gradually developed for a limited range of airport activities until the area is required. I'm just there's that last clause. I just couldn't quite understand. Required for what? Or
If you keep reading past the struck out text, if it until the area
required
is
for
required for
aircraft.
aircraft purposes.
Okay, in general.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I did haven't produced it, but if it would be of use to the panel, Appendix D to the notice of requirement shows the master plan for that
Right.
particular area, so it shows what it will look like. Appendix C to the notice of requirement for the east side area.
Okay. Thank you.
Ms. O'Sullivan, I noted in your relation to your version of of standard 3, there's now only one subclause. When I looked, trying to figure out what had happened with subclause 2, when I went back to Wile's original submission, there were 2 subclauses that the submission sought. One seems to have got lost along the way, and I'd be blowed if I could remember what the second subclause was about, but I thought I'd ask you where it had gone and why it was no longer included.
Okay. So yes, there were 2 subclauses. The second subclause is akin to what is now subclause 5. The first subclause, how do I express this? The first subclause says, except where provided for by Airport Standard 3.3, of which there isn't a 0.3, activities in the Miramar South Precinct shall be limited to commercial or retail activity that meets the definition of an airport or airport-related activity. Now, the problem with that drafting is it becomes quite circular, because you're essentially limiting commercial activity and retail activity to that which meets the definition of an airport or an airport-related activity. Yet that's inherent within the definitions of each of those terms anyway. So it kind of just creates this circular loop where it's not necessary, I guess. I think Mr. Jeffries articulated that a little bit more eloquently than myself in his rebuttal evidence.
I think the issue might perhaps be if you don't have the list in clause 2, whether you need a better drafted version of that concept. That's like for Mr. Jeffries, it's not necessary because he's got clause 2. You don't have clause 2, and therefore do you need something akin to what Weil originally sought?
Perhaps when we on, at least you're ready to go, Kirsty.
I know you.
Like I think as council is about to bail you out, trying to think of a good answer to that curveball. Like I'm happy for you to think about it, but it goes to the structure. Like if it requires thought, then take the time to think about it, because it goes to the structure of clause 3, which, when all said and done, appears to be practically the only substantive issue in contention as between the two of you. So I want a clear fix on where you are landing before Mr. Jeffries replies on the point.
Yep.
So we'll put that in the. I've been putting asterisks in my margin, Mr. I'll record all of the things we've asked or you've offered to provide in a minute.
Yes, and I've got asterisks beside those as well. So
Yes,
we'll provide those as per your directions.
yeah, but at the end we'll talk about when, but take that as a given.
Can I just
well, that's the last question I had.
Okay.
So over to you.
I think one of the reasons, again, maybe I've had too much coffee. One of the main reasons you thought 4 of those uses listed in that clause 3.2 because they didn't have airside access, but the South Coast precinct bounds the airside part of the airport. Is that correct? I mean, I could probably understand why you wouldn't, because it's, you know, that end of the runway and things, but so one of those precincts does have airside access. Is that right? But not the Miramar South one.
But not the Miramar South one, no. But clause 2 does not relate to the South Coast precinct. It only relates to the Miramar South.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Well, like, but the rule as defined is about restrictions in both. So if it's conceivable that those activities might occur in the precinct, like I understand your logic as regards Miramar South, but I think that what the commissioner is saying is, what about the fact is Miramar's not spelled correctly, but I think, is that how you spell Miramar?
It's Miramar. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh well, you get that. But does the same logic apply to the South Coast precinct?
Should those activities be listed for the South Coast precinct? Is that what you?
Well, if there's not if the same logic doesn't apply, it would seem to follow that they should be listed for that precinct. But tell us first whether you think the same logic applies.
Sorry, I'm not. Can you recast the question? I'm not quite following.
Well, your logic for not needing to list those designation exclusions was, well, Miramar South is geographically separated from airside, so there's no possibility of those activities ever occurring in that precinct. And what the commissioner is putting to you is, well, the South Coast adjoins the airside, and so there is, on the face of it, a possibility that those activities could extend to that precinct, and therefore the question is, should they be excluded in that precinct?
No, the South Coast precinct designation does not have such restrictions on it, so it doesn't constrain the use of that area for those activities, airport operations, etc.
Thank you. I can understand that. Commissioner, any other questions?
So Sullivan, the only question I've got is, under your version of standard 3, if it's limited to the old clause 5, are the assessment criteria still relevant? do any of those need to change in any way, assuming there was scope? I mean,
Yeah, that's possibly something that I'll need to go away and look at now that I am proposing, not we, because Mr. Jeffries didn't agree. Yeah, that is something that I might need to go away and have a look at just to see whether they are still relevant and
because I mean, if the standard is focusing on activities that have more than 10% of a gross floor area of a building that accommodates that activity, I'm just wondering about the relevance of some of those assessment criteria.
yeah, yes, that's a very good point. I will, if I'm able to, I'd like to just go away and have a look at that and come back to you on that one.
Mr. Bird, any questions?
Sorry. When you were discussing that 10% before, the gross floor area you said is defined in the plan. So I looked up the definition, and it does say of the building or buildings. So it does leave a sort of discretion for it to be 10% of buildings in those either of those precincts. It's just I'm just thinking about clarification, making sure that standard is very clear what 10% relates to.
So one of the reasons that text was struck out of all buildings in either precinct is because it was, to me, it seemed a little bit unusual to constrain it to the buildings of the entire precinct because that changes over time. So I thought it was more appropriate that it be on that site by site.
Well, that in itself is an interesting matter, Mr. Sullivan, because what does the section 32 say about the reason for that rule? Because if it's worried about retail bleed from centres and controlling that through just providing for ancillary retail in both of those precincts, wouldn't it be worried? Wouldn't it be focused on the total amount of floor space area within the precinct as opposed to each individual building? Or, I mean, I don't know. I haven't got down to that level of detail in the section 32.
I would need to refresh my memory with what the section 32 said about that particular matter.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just surmising what the rationale might be for controlling the quantum of retail development.
The other thing is that 10% of all buildings in the precinct would be much more enabling than 10% of any individual building.
Correct. And that was partly why I had put to Mr. Jeffries essentially constraining this more, because airport buildings are typically quite large. They have quite big footprints. So you could have a range of buildings that are established on the site that don't have any retail, but then you can include them in your calculation. And whether that we'll need to, the Commissioner has mentioned, I'll need to have a look at section 32 to see what it is that they were trying to constrain, and whether referencing individual buildings versus the entire precinct, which one of those two kind of is in keeping more with the section 32 concerns.
I wonder, Ms. O'Sullivan, since you've either volunteered or been volunteered to look into these issues, you might add that to your things that you will respond to us on.
Sure.
Also related to that, Mr. Sullivan, is we will need from both you and Mr. Jeffries on the matters that you agree, and from you on the matters that you don't agree on, a section 32AA. No, it's not a criticism that it hasn't occurred because time constraints, I acknowledge, were pretty tight in terms of conferencing, but that's a requisite that we will rely on.
It's no issue at all. That's only more than reasonable.
Is that it, Commissioners? Yeah, I think the only residual issue is, given that the list of things you and your team are providing seems to have grown by degrees, Ms. Stewart, what are you going to volunteer as to when they provide it? When the
Yes.
team provides that?
We do have, we've got some, we've got evidence for the next hearing stream next Tuesday, as well as some regional council matters as well. There seems to be just a plethora of statutory processes happening all around the country at the moment. So if we could have a couple of weeks, I'd be very grateful.
Right, give me a date.
Esther, have you got any date there? You've got a bigger screen, is it?
The matters that you have just identified, Ms. Stewart, they should be
Okay.
complete by the 8th of March, so that following week of the 11th of March.
If it could be the 13th, I'm actually on leave and will be away from the office until the 11th. So if you give me a day to be able to, what has been done during my absence.
Well, let's just go slow there. Mr. Jeffries, obviously, when is your reply date? Because you've got a stake in how long the while takes to produce this material as well. So
I need to double check that. I believe there's at least another 3 weeks.
well,
Roughly
like
the
we're I think we're deliberating on the 4th, so I think it might be the 28th.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if it was the 13th, that would give you a fortnight in 1 day. Is that enough?
Yes, I'd appreciate a heads up perhaps before that date on where it's going would help me.
Well,
But that otherwise should be okay.
all right. Sounds like we don't have a problem with the 13th. Lucky for some. But I think the Mr. Jeffrey's request is a reasonable one, Ms. O'Sullivan. I imagine I'm not going to direct you do any more conferencing, but in the spirit of the Environment Court Code, I do expect you to consult with Mr. Jeffries if you think that would add value to the process, and giving him a heads up as to where you're tracking on these plan issues to ease his path to producing his reply is obviously will assist the process. So I'll just leave that as a request.
Noted.
And as I say, I'll produce a minute setting out, among other things, Ms. Stewart, what we think you're giving us. And if that differs from your list, then obviously you should come back to us. Well, a little bit longer than the hour that we had allotted for you, but a very productive discussion. Thank you all. Ms. Chappell has been waiting patiently in the background. Should swap.
I have been in contact with you too.
She has been sitting there. Hello, Ms. Chappell.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the panel.
You've been sitting listening patiently to the airport team, and we have your brief written submissions that I should need to get in front of me. And really over to you. How would you like to proceed?
Well, thank you. I don't expect that I will take very much time. I do want to apologise that Ms. Kath O'Brien is not available today. She had intended to be at the previous hearing, but unfortunately this time wasn't able to work for her. However, I'm hopeful that you won't have any specific questions for her. Really, I don't propose to read through the submissions at all. I think that you are probably, the panel has previously heard from Barnes, so you will be aware of Barnes and its role with respect to the operations of the airport. In summary, Barnes is really just adopting a watching brief in relation to the airport provisions, and the purpose of this appearance is to confirm that Barnes continues to support the position that the airport has taken. We have been monitoring the changes that have been proposed as between the various experts, obviously listening to the evidence that's been presented, and simply confirm that we are happy with the direction that is tracking at present.
And I suppose I should ask you the direct question, on the basis that you've been listening this morning, you haven't heard anything that set off alarm bells?
No, not at all. I note that Ms. Dewar did refer earlier to the provisions of the Auckland Unitary Plan, and has been obviously some interesting discussion around the way in which the plans provide for airport zones, precincts, designations, and how all of those things intersect. And it is curious to note that there are quite distinct approaches employed by the various large cities with respect to those plan provisions. I think some of that is born of the distinct way in which the country operates its airports, mostly from a geographical perspective. So Auckland Airport does things quite differently, but then again, it also has a number of smaller airports that it is trying to manage as well. And obviously that's not the case in Wellington. So whereas in Auckland there aren't any provisions in the underlying zone provision, all of the policies and objectives sit within the precincts, and then of course you have the designations that sit over top of those for the airport activities. So quite a different way of providing for it than here, but I don't think that there is any one way of doing it. There's more than one way to skin a cat, I guess, is the best way of thinking of it.
Okay, any questions from Ms. Chappell? I don't have any. Well, that might be the shortest appearance on record. Thank you very much, Ms. Chappell.
Thank you. Good luck with your deliberations.
Thank you. We will adjourn the hearing and say we'll produce a minute saying what material we think we're getting from Waiau, along the same lines as the one we produced following last part of the hearing, and call it a day. Adjourn until stream 7.